Hello, everybody. Slowly, people are coming into the session. Nira's letting folks in from the waiting room. Welcome, everyone, to the Vancouver Roundtable. This was already a crisis, intersectional impact of COVID-19 and gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. On April 30th, we, the Building Leadership Capacity to Address GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada, introduced the virtual Roundtable series to host conversations and exchanges that consider the differential impact of COVID-19 for non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. This roundtable is really an opportunity to share strategies, practices, and work out ideas through conversation. As we've expressed at our roundtables, we're not focused on leading, but instead leveraging and hosting these conversations at a national level. This roundtable adopts a social justice approach that suggests that a more comprehensive analysis and collective discussion of social problems will yield more effective social action, advocacy, strategies, and responses. We want to start today by saying thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. We're heartened by the number of people who've registered across Canada. My name is Margarita Pinton-Perez, and I'm the Senior Coordinator for the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence in Immigrant and Refugee Communities at OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Joining me today as co-host of this conversation are Nira Elgueta, Project Coordinator of the GBV Building Leadership Capacity Project at OCASI, and Parminder Flora from Mosaic.
Thank you, Margarita. Hello, everybody. My name is Parminder Flora, and I am welcoming everyone in participating this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. I am the specialist for the violence prevention programs at Mosaic, which is one of the regional partners on the Building Leadership Capacity Project mentioned by Margarita. Today's roundtable is focused on the Metro Vancouver area, and we will reflect and discuss the advocacy and survivor-led work by and for non-status refugee and immigrant women taking place here. As the regional partner, we are going to moderate the discussion with speakers from Mosaic, the BC Society of Transition Houses, Legal and Law Corporation, and the Vancouver Lower Mainland Multicultural Family Support Services Society. I do want to start off with acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. It's important to us from the outset to express our solidarity with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island who continue to experience colonial violence, including intersectional gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It has been 1 year since the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It is important to reflect on what it means to do this work and to host these conversations in this context of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We also draw from critical race scholars in Canada who have recognized the importance of addressing colonial violence as a first step in healing across communities. We take seriously the notion that Shireen Razak emphasized in 2014, which is that we cannot move into recognizing the humanity of refugees, immigrants, or other people if our day-to-day life is intensely structured by the inhumanity with which we have treated Indigenous people. Thank you all for joining us today and engaging with us. Margarita.
Thank you, Parminder. It's me, Nira.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So just want to do a little bit of housekeeping rules. For today's meeting, we encourage you all to be on the speaker's view so you can follow along with your share screen. We want everyone here today to participate in today's conversation in ways that feel comfortable for you. At the same time, to minimize distractions and keep safe space, we have disabled the camera option and microphones are mute for all participants. Throughout today's presentation, we will have one of our team members, myself, and I will be attending the chat. If you have there, you will have the ability to chat with others, send us messages, or a message to everyone participating today. We encourage you to share comments, feedback, and if you have any technical issues, we will do our best to support you. I will compile a list of questions and comments which we aim to address in the last 15 minutes of our session. If we don't get there today, we will do our best to respond and follow up when we share our recording, the PowerPoint PDF, and a feedback survey in the following days. To start with the chat, we encourage you to share your location, the organization you're coming from, networks and communities you're joining us from. Margarita?
Wonderful, thank you, thanks. All right, so just to start, I'm just going to briefly say, this project, it's called the Building Leadership Capacity to Address Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women Across Canada. It is a 5-year project funded by Women in Gender Equality, formerly Status of Women, and it's part of their GBV strategy, Canada's strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. Our project consists of a growing network of service providers, organizational leaders, community advocates, and academic researchers. It's led by OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, in partnership with many organizations in Edmonton, Fredericton, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver. And this project really builds on decades of community-based advocacy and initiatives to address gender-based violence within and against immigrant and refugee community. As the project develops, the ideas of this network will grow, and we look forward to this growing as a national network. Neera is going to take over, but we'll also give you some more insight and some more details on how you'll be able to participate with this growing network.
Thank you, Margarita. So the objectives for today's meetings are very ambitious, but we want you to learn about our project, the research, and the blueprint in progress. To learn from our speakers, community members, organizational leaders, and advocates reflecting on how we do community advocacy work to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women in Vancouver, the challenges of advocacy work, and the importance of this work, especially now in the context of COVID-19. At the end, we will also share with you ways to get involved and participate in our project and in the building of our blueprint. The agenda for today, we will be covering a lot of information, copy of the slides and recording of the presentation, as I mentioned it before, will be shared on a later day with all of you. If at any point you need to pause, take a break, please do so and check in with yourself or a colleague. Remember that you can post any questions in the chat at any point of this presentation, and we will take some time at the end to respond to those questions. Margarita?
Great, thank you, Neera. So to start, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on our project and to outline what the project objectives are. So this project really calls attention to the urgent and unique issues of GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. The idea is for us to build a strong national network among service providers, organizational leaders, community members, advocates, and non-status refugee and immigrant women to strengthen the regional and national work that's addressing GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women. And doing this using survivor-led and community-based advocacy models. So really to do this work, we're thinking of combining, or what we're combining 2 promising practices that are already underway in Toronto. And these 2 promising practices are focused on building the leadership capacity of communities, organizational leaders, advocates, and non-status refugee and immigrant women to prevent and respond to GBV in ways that focus on leadership training, advocacy, education, and networking. So the 2 promising practices that we're referring to are the Peer Champions program, which uses popular education to build leadership capacity and foster connections between and among non-status refugee and immigrant women, and the Community Advocacy Network, which establishes and leverages existing grassroots networks among non-status refugee survivors, service providers, and other civil society leaders in order to build community capacity to advocate for and develop alternative responses to addressing GBV. These 2 promising practices themselves are modeled after existing groups, in this case in Ontario, the Rights of Non-Status Women Network and OCASI's Peer Champion campaign. And Neera and I next are just going to briefly give you some background on those 2. So in the case of the community-based advocacy strategy, it's modeled after the Rights of Non-Status Women Network. For over 14 years, the Rights of Non-Status Women Network is a grassroots network of service providers and activists that's been gathering together to strategize around how to best support women with precarious immigration status and to deal with the multiple forms of violence in their lives. The Rights of Non-Status Women's Network is based in Toronto, and it uses a community-based model to be more responsive to gaps and supports for NSRI women, as well as to develop shared analysis of policies affecting NSRI communities. The network organizes educational forums for service providers on issues such as housing, mental health, impacts of immigration law, and it focuses on grassroots advocacy, building capacity, and developing a diversity of solutions that are not constrained by service user models. A frequent benefit of the organizing efforts and the advocacy efforts of this group is that it shows how informal networks among service providers fostered through these activities, educational activities, are beneficial for creative case management, for building mutual support, as well as a shared analysis across various silos in the NGO sector. We heard from the Rights and Non-Status Women's Network at our meeting, which was hosted on July 30th. So we welcome for you to check out that recording. We have them on our website, and Neera is going to share the link in the chat for the network, Rights of Non-Status Women Network. Neera? You want to share about the Peer Champions Network? I put you there on the spot to share the link, so.
Sorry, I was talking to myself. Yes, I just did, and now I'm happy to talk about the Peer Champion. So, as Margarita mentioned, the goal of the IRC NFF campaign, so the Peer Champion campaign, is to build community-based responses to address gender-based violence among immigrant, refugee, and refugee communities. The campaign creates strong connections with community leaders who have deep and trusted ties with immigrant refugees, and organizations serving those individuals in their communities. The peer champions are trained to identify and support newcomer women experiencing violence, and to educate the larger community about the effects of violence against women among immigrant and refugee communities. Here, it's a small sample of some of the events created and run by the 2019 Peer Champion campaign. Every year, some 15 peer champions from across Ontario are selected based on their leadership skills, knowledge of how violence affects their communities. And once those peer champions receive their training, they go back to their community to run educational events. Peer champions have the freedom to create and deliver their community education events in whatever form or way that fits the needs of their community. Peer champions deliver community events in faith spaces, student unions, neighborhood groups, in the workplace, and drop-in centers, or in what we have also identified entry points as language school and food banks. Margarita?
Thank you, Neera. All right, so very briefly now, we're going to share a part of the process of this project and its development, and focus right now on the research that we did last year, 2019. And it kind of helps you know that where are we at right now. So this project, it is a 5-year project, and it started last year, and it started with the partnership developing those partnerships across Canada, and there was also the research component. So we've actually completed the research, we've organized and analyzed the data, and it's shaping what's called a blueprint. And you've probably heard this term, you've heard this concept, and this blueprint term actually comes from the language of the funder, but it's really defined as a practical, a how-to, a resource that'll provide an outline of how we bring these 2 promising practices to life. And the idea being that other organizations can then replicate these promising practices and adapt it to their local context. So in terms of going back now to talk to you a little bit about the research, in designing the project and our research, a primary objective was really to test some of our assumptions. So not only the assumptions that we had from existing scholarship, but also some of the assumptions around how to do this kind of work, since we were referring to models that were based in Toronto, Ontario. At the same time, it gave us an opportunity to reflect and really think about some of the terms that we're using in our project. So we've dropped a few different details here, but when we think about it, we're using terms that, as much as they are popular, they can sometimes be confusing. For example, when we're referring to advocacy, when we're talking about leadership or capacity building. So we think it's really important to know what these terms mean and why we're using them and how we're using them. So part of our research was, learning more about the local realities in the different regions where we've established partnerships. So in Ottawa, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Fredericton. And some of our questions were, how does advocacy strategies, how do they develop in other regions? Does it align with what we know is happening in Toronto? Does it not align? What's happening in the other regions, and how might we maybe adjust and adapt our approach to build and support what currently exists? And at the same time, it's an excellent opportunity when we're doing this research to really meet people and build relationships, which is such an important part of this work. So we were also able to kind of collect a baseline, right? So an idea to be able to understand the impacts of our project, to understand what already exists and how we can continue to build. What you're seeing right here is on the screen is a visual summary from when we shared our research journey presentation, which took place on July 16th, 2020. And at the time there was 3 of us that were on this research journey: Selena, who I think is also joining our session right now, and Mira. So you will be able to find the recording and the presentation for this, but this gives you a sense. It's supposed to be a journey, following it here from the top left and moving. The journey of what we heard and what we gathered and the way that we've organized that material. So very briefly, again, because I want to jump in and I want to hear from everyone in Vancouver, but really briefly, we want to share a few highlights from our findings and specifically focus on what we heard coming directly from community advocates, service providers, organizational leaders, and non-status refugee and immigrant women across the regions, which Nira can touch upon a little bit more. In the case of our consultations that we had with community advocates and service providers, we conducted consultations and focus groups with 76 service providers. And we asked questions around what supports and services existed and rooted in community-based advocacy and also survivor-led interventions across the different regions. Nira, go ahead, because she's just going to share a little bit of what we heard with non-status refugee and immigrant women.
Perfect. So we also conducted focus group and interviews with 49 non-status refugee and immigrant women who we recruit through our partner organizations and the stakeholders we consulted. We use a participatory, community-based and trauma-informed approach in designing the focus group. For example, we pilot our questions with a group of non-status refugee and immigrant women survivors who provided critical feedback to continue our work. Margarita?
Great. Thanks, Nira. Great. And what you're seeing on the screen is a journey, a map that we included also as part of our interview guide so that it could be something visual for people to follow the different themes that we were going to touch upon in the interviews. All right, so something we want to highlight today, and especially because of the conversation that we're having and that's a pending conversation with the Vancouver panelists, is we want to highlight about the really important work of advocacy that we learned about that's happening across the different regions, and how we learned also service providers are uniquely positioned to engage in advocacy, public policy advocacy in particular, to raise awareness on issues related to GBV. And I think for us, what's really important to capture here is it's important to understand the different channels through which advocacy was happening. So, this typology of advocacy is the way that we were able to organize what we were hearing and what we heard. So from more formalized networks to more informal networks, but just the important that even in those softer ways that advocacy might be happening, for example, it can be planning tables, or it can be umbrella groups, it can be community groups, but the importance of seeing all of that different interpretation and practice of advocacy. Going back to the visual summary, we do really love seeing all of this. I know there's a lot to capture here. And so in terms of, we're hearing about all of the amazing advocacy work that's happening, and it's happening, but we also heard the challenges of doing that work, the systemic challenges of doing the work, the issues of capacity, issues of funding priorities. So advocacy was frequently also talked about as kind of this invisible labor, or this kind of labor that's happening off the side of the desk, as some service providers refer to. And so here I'm kind of referring to that top right corner where you see kind of the pylons, right? The different kinds of challenges that service providers refer to. And so we really learned as well that, that also some of this work can sometimes be overlooked or underfunded, but it's such an important element of the work that shapes and pushes forward addressing GBV against NSRI communities. It enables organizations, service providers, communities to push for access, advocacy being this big piece about access for all members of the community. And in this case, regardless of immigration status, you know, that was a big piece that came up. And it's also at the same time a really important part of the history of the work of addressing GBV against NSRI communities and communities that have been made vulnerable due to immigration policies, access or criteria, or what mandates might be existing around who's eligible for services. So when we're hearing also that history about the advocacy work, and that's really been truly captured as well in the roundtables, it's just about the historical details, but it really points us into an interesting direction, capturing the work and the way we can maybe create a further shared vision for the work at a national scale. So this is where this blueprint, this idea of like, what does this all mean? How does that research engage and inform this blueprint, right? So what would it look like if we're talking about some of these challenges and we can further the capacity and the support to do this work? What does like an infrastructure of advocacy at a regional and a national level look like? What happens if we're navigating all these multiple systems, right? The health system, education, all these different systems that service providers need to do. But what happens if it's not just thinking about it as being carried out by individuals at each organization, but thinking about it collaboratively, so working together and redistributing some of that work as well. So the leadership and capacity component of this work, we're also thinking of it doing it collectively. And so an objective for us here, again, coming back to this idea, the objective of creating a network that really aims to provide a voice for NSRI women in these issues, bridging that together, and building a national network among service providers, organizational leaders, community members, advocates, non-status refugee and immigrant women to strengthen this existing and ongoing work to address GBV. Mira?
Yes. So we set out on a journey to hear from non-status refugee and immigrant women and to hear from their impressions of the terms safety, healing, and leadership that are so central to our project and what it means to be a survival. Were they comfortable with mainstream definitions? More significantly, what were their own definitions for those terms? How did they experience and the experiences and perspective challenge our assumptions about what a survival-led project might look like? The non-status refugee and immigrant group of women we interviewed challenged the assumptions of survival, migrant women, and leaders. They introduced us to their ideas of community forms of healing and promoting safety. They talk about promoting neutral places to access services and creating safe spaces to build community. Margarita?
Right, and so Mira, what we heard from NSRI women, it also needs to inform our blueprint, right? So we're hearing from NSRI women around, they're reimagining what it means, the concept of leadership, talking to us about survivorship as a process, this more collective community-based approach to safety, and also, as Mira emphasized at the end, these kind of neutral spaces to make space for more holistic healing. So we heard about, you see in the corner on the top, the left, bottom corner, spaces for sports and joy. So not always the emphasis on pain. So for us, this part of the blueprint for the Peer Champions piece really means having NSRI women be central to the creation and the delivery of this, and avoiding framing survivorship as this kind of static, maybe label, and instead considering how survivor's ongoing process, not limited also to one kind of source of oppression. So we're trying to create capacity for healing outside of that survivor label and really trying to listen to those discussions around these neutral places where humanity can be restored, where spaces of joy, community, and shared healing can take place. All right, that's a lot of information that we shared there, and we wanted to do that briefly. Again, we did host a session on July 16th. There's a recording, and it's also on our website. At the very end of this discussion in the roundtable, we'll share more details for how you can access that information. We don't want to take up too much more time now, so we want to welcome back our speakers. Parminder, as well, is now going to take over and moderate the next part, which is the roundtable. In this discussion, just so you get a sense of how it's going to work out, speakers are first invited to participate and highlight some of the community-based advocacy and/or survivor-led work that's already underway in Vancouver. The second question that they'll be asked allows them to kind of speak to those challenges of doing advocacy work in their practice. And then the last question is going to be grounded in the context of COVID-19. So it's going to allow us to kind of talk about what's happening right now, right? And the urgency of this kind of work during this critical time. So I'll let Parminder take over and introduce the speakers.
Forgot to unmute. Thank you, Margarita. I do want to take this opportunity to actually ask all the speakers to come back. I think Harjeet was the only one that was without video. I would like to start off by introducing the speakers who will comprise our roundtable and as well as do the opening. We do have with us Harjeet Kaur. She is the Director of Training at the BC Society of Transition Houses, and she has worked in the anti-violence sector for over 20 years. She comes with a background in research, project management, training, provincial coordination, policy development, and supporting women with lived experience at a variety of violence prevention organizations. Her PhD focused on the exploration of healthcare and police responses of immigrant South Asian women experiencing gender-based violence in British Columbia, and offered service delivery and policy improvement for increasing their health and safety. She is also a registered clinical counselor. We also have joining us today Maria Socorro Mangila Nguyen. She is a registered social worker in British Columbia. She has been working as a community-based social worker in the settlement and anti-violence fields in Metro Vancouver since 1995. She is currently the Executive Director of the Vancouver and Lower Mainland Multicultural Family Support Services Society. She is also pursuing her doctoral studies in social work at the University of Calgary. Her research and interests include immigrant and refugee women survivors of intimate partner violence and/or family violence, as well as migration trauma. Her dissertation research will focus on the narratives of 1.5 generation Filipinx youth in Metro Van. She identifies herself as a first-generation settler, a Filipinx Canadian, and respectfully acknowledges the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We also have joining us today Kamaljeet Kaur Lihal. She received her law degree in 1989 from the University of British Columbia and was called to the bar in 1990. She first worked as an associate in a local firm, and then in 1992, she opened her own law firm, Lihal Law Corporation, and since then continues to operate a successful practice with a focus on immigration law. She provides pro bono advocacy on behalf of immigrant women who are victims of domestic violence and is active in pursuing legal and policy reform on their behalf. Ms. Lihal is both a certified civil and family mediator. She is a qualified arbitrator. Ms. Lihal was an appointed member of the Civil Resolution Tribunal in BC from 2015 to March 2019. She was an appointed member of the BC Review Board from 1998 to 2010, serving in the capacity of alternate chair. She is currently a member at large on the CBA National Women's Lawyers Forum. She is member of the CBA Law for Future Fund Committee. She is also a member of the CBA Immigration Anti-Racism Committee and a member of the CCR Legal Affairs Advisory Committee. She also is a board member of the South Asian Legal Clinic of BC. Ms. Lihal is a past chair of the CBA National Equality Subcommittee and a past trustee for the SABA North American Foundation. Apologies for that. Active in her community, Ms. Lihal serves as chair on the board of directors of Options Community Services Society, a nonprofit organization, and aside from her work and volunteer roles, she is balancing life with her husband, raising their 4 children. Those are the speakers for our roundtable today, and I will keep moving forward, and I also would like to introduce Simona Panevska. She is our family law advocate working with clients from various ethnic backgrounds. Simona is passionate for increasing access to justice regarding all legal matters, while primarily focusing on family law and the barriers associated with that challenge. Today, I am very delighted to invite Simona to speak to the integrated services delivery model utilized at Mosaic. This is an opportunity to hear about the ways in which collaboration and coordination of services is important to address and support gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women, the different intersective systems and harms that women face daily. I'm glad to introduce Simona.
Awesome, thank you, Parminder. And thank you, Margarita, Nira, and Okasi. I'm very glad to be here, share ideas and learn from everybody and these lovely women that were introduced. I'm going to begin by kind of providing an overview of what my role is, kind of what you had touched on, Margarita. What is advocacy here? How I assist women, particularly women with non-status refugee and immigrant women. The next slide will go into an overview of kind of like what we're going to be talking about briefly. This is my contact information if needed. But so the BC Law Foundation and their funding for access to justice initiatives, many we already know and we have available across the country, such as legal aid, legal clinics, and others that are kind of unique to BC, such as the community-based advocacy and specialized advocacy services. So for specialized advocacy, we have immigration, the human rights, mental health advocacy, and for community-based is where I kind of come into, we have the poverty law advocates and family law advocates. The community-based programs really try to target clients with various needs and essentially assist women with multiple barriers. So for example, a big chunk of family law advocacy was created as there was quite a big concern echoed by many workers regarding women, especially when looking at gender-based violence after witnessing a huge gap and echoing the struggles women had. So the future goal from the Law Foundation is to be able to have an advocate in every community to assist with these legal matters. We're trained by the Law Foundation and each advocate has a supervising lawyers. I know that there are other provinces that have, I believe they're called like a legal support worker or a court facilitator, but the BC Law Foundation really focused and expanded on that community-based approach. So poverty law advocates, just to mention, they cover everything except family, criminal, and family law advocates on the other matter we cover family law related matters, child support, and due to the nature of my work, sometimes it could be immigration. So now at Mosaic, women with precarious status can get legal support as well as counseling or maybe support from victim services and other great programs that we have. With 3 advocates, we can kind of work together collaboratively to help the client, whether it is maybe a housing that they need assistance with, family law, and immigration while providing interpretation. I myself, I'm new to Mosaic. I've worked as a family law advocate in a different organization, and immigration law was honestly a very big struggle. Being at Mosaic, though, I have noticed a difference. It's helped these women that would typically fall through the cracks if interpretation was not available or that immigration piece was not taken care of. So I also help women regardless of their status and income. I don't consider income to be an issue, as I've seen a lot of women who have experienced financial abuse, and this has been a great barrier, I believe, especially when trying to get support from legal aid. So my scope of service varies. I assist and support clients. I accompany clients during court or dispute resolutions. I may be providing information or building legal capabilities within the community. I try to keep in mind, how can I make my services available and known in the community? So often that may be outreach at cultural centers to share maybe my information, legal pamphlets, or other helpful resources in multiple languages, connect with different outreach workers that speak the different language to connect, post information on bulletin boards, etc. And speaking of accessibility, since working at Mosaic, majority of my clients do not speak English. So many women have asked, you know, could I get in touch with you through WhatsApp? It's just really easy for me to do that. So that's one thing I'm trying to currently work around at the moment, is how can I utilize and to what extent to make information readily accessible to women, and while also keeping in mind, you know, the legal boundaries and protocols. Many have told me that they feel more comfortable to use like a language app like Google Translate when we use phones to communicate and share information. So I have found that it has worked for me, and if it works for the client, then that works for me as well. So keeping advocacy in mind on my daily scope of work, we also try to identify gaps in services and collaborating with others to develop maybe legal resources, organizing pro bono clinics, etc. We do report monthly to the Law Foundation to inform them if there are any gaps that we have maybe noticed and how we can approach that. And again, whether it is possibly setting up a legal clinic or creating a new pamphlet in a different language. For example, one of the biggest gap that was noticed was application for legal aid, especially in remote areas. So advocates were now added to a pilot project by Legal Aid where we can complete and send a legal aid application on behalf of our clients. Again, this is less traumatizing for women that are facing abuse, not to share their story over and over again to all these different people. And this can be done at a very kind of client-centered approach. Especially again, when I'm talking about here at Mosaic, where we have settlement workers. So we have settlement workers in which would total we have over 20 languages, but there's also a funding for my program to also pay for interpretation services. So that has been a huge struggle in the past, finding somebody to translate, being able to find them on a time-sensitive matter. Or sometimes we would have to leave the onus on the client to find an interpreter. So at Mosaic, having that interpretation service and settlement workers that can assist has been very helpful for clients. Of course, interpretation is a huge continuous struggle. There are certain legal components that we're trying to navigate at the moment, but I'm hoping that this issue continues to be highlighted, and in the future, funding could be increased and readily accessible. It is quite overlooked, I've found, and I'm a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of times women have agreed to, you know, to whatever, maybe it was an agreement with a social worker or something where interpretation was not provided, or even counsel. So an agreement was made without adequate interpretation. As family law advocates, we're not allowed to approach the bench and represent clients in court. However, judges are coming around that and have been quite aware of our roles, especially in provincial court. We have been able to assist client as a friend of the court when it's quite evident that the client needs some assistance with their speech or during cross-examination. It might be a small step, but it's been amazing for women when there's, as we all seen, a great power imbalance, and they do not have a lawyer, and now it's time to go to court and the respondent is standing there with counsel. And another thing that I do regularly if court is involved is pairing up an interpreter with my client. As we all know, it's quite, when you're faced with a stressful situation, especially trying to speak about past trauma, you might be losing not only English, but your own native tongue language. I find that it's happened to me. When I get nervous, I lose all the languages I can speak and I just kind of startle. So I always assure interpretations available. And again, I think it's one of those things that it's quite overlooked, but I try to see in what ways I can approach that. Our role is, of course, not to replace lawyers. We're simply filling the gap and providing legal support if lawyers are not available. I find lawyers that they've appreciated when clients have an advocate, because we prepare all their paperwork, we gather their documents together, provide a little bit of education support of what to expect, what not to expect from this meeting, questions to ask, and maybe debrief and take notes. So to kind of wrap it all up, I'll provide an example. So Parminder might be working with a client who's currently seeking counseling and receiving support from the victim services team. There's an urgent protection matter and an immigration piece that needs to be addressed. Now we can work as a team to help that client together with an interpreter, keeping in mind other barriers and looking at other ways that we could assist this client. And of course, if a protection is needed, we could go to court together, obtain a protection order, and we can deal with the next steps, whether it is with the client or as a team together. We have a good chat with the client and see in what ways we can make the situation less stressful. I asked my women, would it be easier to create a new email address? Just use that email address moving forward. I don't want you to see my name pop up when you're just enjoying your time with your children and watching TV, for example. I just try to think, we work together to look at ways, how can we make the situation less stressful for the client? And is there anything else we can provide to assist the situation? With that email example, many women have said that, it was a small step, but it's helped me get organized, or I can now kind of differentiate between what I have to do and spending some downtime with my children. Even getting a burner phone, for example, I know TELUS was great with that. They loaned us a bunch of cell phones. If my client does not have safe access to a cell phone, this is something I can provide to that client, and they can safely call me or their lawyer to discuss their legal matter. So what we do as a team and doing it well together, and our ability to communicate effectively, is what I think makes this Access to Justice program work well for our women. And at Mosaic, having that integrated approach, it is very readily accessible for non-status refugee and immigrant women, especially with the programs as listed on the slide that show kind of the different programs that we have at Mosaic: employment, counseling, and settlement services. There's certainly a gap in our society when women become involved in the legal process, so I try to bridge that and look at ways I could mitigate the stress and all the external kind of matters that connect together. It is overwhelming and traumatizing, as we all know, let alone when additional barriers are included, such as language. So the biggest way I have found myself to be helpful is educating and empowering women to make imperative legal decisions. Lastly, of course, with COVID, I think there's actually a little bit of opportunity to promote human rights, and then especially in time of crisis, I try to echo my clients' concerns now more than ever. I found that in a way this pandemic has shed a light on what was already a crisis, as today's title mentioned, and I was hoping this can guide us in a better direction, whether it's reaching out to funders to highlight what is the issue is, ask for additional funding, maybe connect with others like we're doing today, and just see how we can better assist clients and catering our services to what's happening. Many of my clients were able to go out for a walk, for example, and chat with me while they're at home living the abuser. So I'm worried about the changes coming up with COVID, being isolated and being stuck at home, how that will change, especially for women who, like I said, are stuck at home with the abuser. So these weather changes and little things that we kind of overlook, I think is gonna be challenging coming up in the next few months. And I'm also wondering, how the justice system will adapt to these changes. For example, I know a lot of the clients and my women were getting very, very, very nervous when everybody was getting released that was supposed to be incarcerated, for example. So things like that, I'm wondering if what we are doing will be taken into consideration when these changes are happening that are, heightened by COVID. So I'm glad we're almost connecting today, because we're sharing ideas to better promote our practices and kind of highlight these challenges that are present across the province and Canada. And hopefully we can keep connecting and share lovely ideas. And the next 2 slides, I've done a brief summary of services in BC. For example, the Ending Violence Organization. POVNet is where you could find an advocate based on your location or legal issues, and a few other extra resources.
Thank you, Simona. You've done a wonderful job in highlighting the Mosaic programs and the coordination of the programs to try to really stay client-centered and to try to meet the needs of the diverse communities coming in with a number of complexities such as language barrier and of course the cultural diversity as well. Thank you so much, Simona. We are going to move now to the first question that we will be posing to our panelists. And this is a question that each one of the speakers will be able to address. We will start off with Harjeet addressing this question, which is basically, what are the ways in which you practice community-based advocacy work to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee immigrant women in Vancouver? And what makes this type of work and approach unique to addressing gender-based violence against non-status refugee immigrant women in Vancouver? Harjeet.
Thank you, Parminder. I want to start off by acknowledging that our office is located on the unceded Coast Salish territory in Vancouver. I am grateful and thankful for this opportunity and honor to be here at this roundtable today. And so thank every single one of the organizers for the project and our involvement at the table. So what I have is some of the slides, and so BC Society of Transition Houses is a provincial organization for anti-violence workers. And what we do is to support programs by keeping members up to date on emerging provincial, national and international issues, advocating on their behalf to government and other stakeholders, providing public education and intervention activities, as well as researching and publishing position papers on legal issues, policy analysis, practice guidance, and developing and delivering training. So one of the, say if Margarita, if you could carry on and change my slide for me, I would really appreciate, thank you. So here we are, and we support 120 transition houses, second and third stage houses and safe homes, as well as 86 prevention, education, advocacy, counseling, and empowerment programs for women, for children who are exposed to violence against their moms across the province. And it includes non-offending parents, and it could be a dad as well. For the next slide that we have, we do a public awareness campaign as well. So what we do is, in terms of providing that provincial and national presence, our work supports these programs across BC. Next slide, please. So one of our projects, and I think a lot of the work that we do is by engaging in our projects and initiatives that are on these levels. One of the projects that we have was this public awareness campaign known as You Are Not Alone. And through this project, what we did was we reached out in different languages, and there were about 5 different languages that we had reached out in. And our hope was to provide information to non-status refugee and immigrant women about what they can find in a transition house once they got there. One of the factors that we were aware of through our other project, Building Supports project, was that women were often asking, what can they find there? What's going to happen to them and their children? So this was one of the public awareness projects that we thought would reach out to these populations and be able to be inclusive for all of them. Next slide, please. So I think these are stats. All of you are very familiar with the stats in terms of the numbers of violence against women. the only stat that I would like to highlight is the one that's really relevant to BC, and that is every year in BC, more than 13,000 people seek police assistance to stop violence at the hands of current or former spouse or dating partners. Now, what remains unknown or hidden are the numbers for immigrant, non-status, and refugee women. So these numbers, again, are not very visible, and they remain on that level of, what are we dealing with, and how many women are there that we need to support? Next slide, please. So some of the projects the BC Society of Transition Houses has been engaged in has been the building supports project, reducing barriers, getting home, reaching out with yoga, increasing access for Indigenous women, technology safety, peace programs, and violence is preventable, as well as the Believe project. So I'll take just a few minutes to just kind of go through them briefly, just to highlight what those intersections are for non-status refugee and immigrant women. So for the next slide, our building supports project. This was a project that was funded, and we did this project from 2014 till about 2017. And what it did for us was highlighted the gaps as well as the barriers that existed for non-status refugee and immigrant women. Yet the other thing that it did was provided us with the policy recommendations that were critical to the work that we carried on doing. So what it aimed to do was to touch upon the complex work that was present for many different areas. It included police, legal systems, child protection, medical services, affordable housing, mental health and addictions, and more. And so what we did was take the tools that we had and weave that across our ongoing work at the association and on different levels. One of the things that we also wanted to present was that how relevant these projects, even though they've been done in the past, they were to present times. And so when we looked at the gaps and we looked at housing, these were the impetus for us for seeking more grants to doing the work. For example, if we did any advocacy, this was where it was impactful and what we needed to do. If you could just change my slide for me, please. So with this is something that I touched on earlier. Again, You Are Not Alone campaign was weaved through, and there was multiple levels of this campaign that was done. When COVID, at the onset of COVID, what we did was we brought back this campaign and took it across BC to make sure that women who are from these multilingual, multivariate communities were able to just be reassured of the fact that they were not alone. These programs and transition houses were available for them, and they were in different languages. And the hope was that every transition house across BC had the capacity, the skills, and the training to work with them and support them with the resources that they had. Next slide, please. What we also did was with the You're Not Alone campaign, we were able to have the funding to then expand it to other languages, and it included German and French as well. Next slide, please. So one of the other projects that we had was reducing barriers. And this is an ongoing training project that we have, that we go into 4 different communities each year and train the workers to work with women who come with the intersections of mental health and substance use and face that restricted access to transition and second stage housing or even safe homes. As a result, what we found was that, it's again, a hope to increase the, to decrease the vulnerabilities and the homelessness and further violence that women could be subjected to. With this training, what we hope to do is to incorporate trauma-informed practices and to reduce these barriers. So these are trainings that we do each year in 4 different locations across BC, and they have been really popular, and we've heard feedback from our programs in terms of how valuable they are. And mind you, for non-status, refugee and immigrant women, these intersections remain invisible on some levels, but they're also not acknowledged. I think that's, again, a huge barrier that's there that we need to acknowledge. Next slide, please. The Getting Home Project. And again, this was what also came out from our Building Supports project, that one of the barriers that, that women face in general, as well as non-status refugee and immigrant women, is the transportation issue, is housing. And the Getting Home Project in particular is one that is focused on reducing barriers to safe, secure, and affordable long-term housing for women in BC after leaving violence. And so what we are hoping is that this project, as it's in the final round of its funding, will be able to provide policy recommendations to alleviate these barriers, that women will be able to access appropriate housing. Next slide, please. So another way that we are doing advocacy at this provincial level is to bring forward another project that we are just kind of finishing this year, and that's the ROE project. It's Reaching Out with Yoga. It's a 5-year project, and again, what was done was to go out into individual houses and select sites where we could actually reach out and provide these skills to women, so that they could alleviate any stress or the levels of trauma they have experienced, and to work to heal themselves with. Next slide, please. The Technology Safety Project is something that we started in 2007. And what it has done for us is really highlighted the need that exists both for workers and for women out there. So at first we were doing these projects, you know, it were multi-levels of funding that we had through different grants. The hope was to encourage, you know, women to be mindful of safety, privacy, accessibility, having their autonomy, having justice, accessibility, justice, and human rights. What we also wanted to do was to raise awareness around how technology can be used both to harm women and to keep women safe. So one of the examples that we had was, how can you use a GPS on your phone to remain safe? How can you link it with the Apple accounts, which has been critical, especially in current times. So what we did also, given the onset of COVID, was to provide technology training to our workers across the province, as well as collaborate with community organizations to assist them to educate and increase awareness for the women who are working with, you know, with violence in their lives. One of the other initiatives that we have had in working with our projects with the onset of COVID has been, we offered free training to all our workers across the province, and this was online training in the hope to increase capacity. We acknowledge that the isolation that workers could be facing, or organizations were facing with the lack of sufficient workers, could impact the services that they provided. So for us to increase the capacity of workers and organizations, the free online training was something of an initiative that we undertook at the onset of COVID. Next slide, please. The peace programs. And I think just to highlight the fact that we don't only work with the transition houses, we also work with the children and the youth who have witnessed violence. So this was something, this is a project, we have got 86 of them across the province. And this project works with children and youth aged from 3 to 18 who have been exposed to violence in their life. And again, these services are free and confidential for children across BC. Next slide, please. This was another public awareness campaign that we have done, Love Doesn't Hurt. And this was again to highlight and expose the impact of children and the numbers of children exposed to witnessing violence. So this is something that we did a couple of years ago, but it remains relevant for communities across BC. Next slide, please. children exposed to domestic violence. And again, it is, you all are aware of the numbers, as I said, but again, just to give you some sense, we've got Violence is Preventable is a project that we have, which works to provide that education to children in school and youth. So being aware of violence and how a preventative method so that they can start early and understand what the impact is for them. Next slide, please. And so this is the Violence is Preventable project. All this information is available on our website, and it remains relevant. And I think now what we're trying to do is revise the curriculum so that it's more relevant for non-status refugee and immigrant women across BC as well. Next slide, please. Last and not least, the Believe Project. What we found was that, students who are in grades 8 to 6 understand, it's important for them to understand what healthy relationships look like, and to understand what sexual violence was, and to be able to then be respectful in their relationships. And this was something that was, again, funded to a project that we had, but shared across the province with our programs. So that, I think, sums up, how we do advocacy across the province, and how we help and work with projects and the frontline workers that interact with us and expand upon the work that they do. So again, our hope is to lend that support to the frontline workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Harjeet. That is an amazing, thorough overview of the projects and the work that's being undertaken at the BC Society of Transition Houses. I am aware of the work, but when it's been presented in this format, it's just amazing. The diversity, looking at everything from safety, safe housing, to technology, to the self-care and well-being of women, and that's just amazing. You touched on a lot of different things, so I'm sure that we'll be able to revisit some of the information that you presented in the next couple of questions. So thank you so much for that, Harjeet. And so we're going to continue along. We are getting a little bit behind timing here today. I'm going to ask Kamaljeet to actually answer question number 1. And again, we're looking at what are the ways in which you practice community-based advocacy work to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee immigrant women in Vancouver, and what makes this type of work and approach unique to addressing gender-based violence against NSRI women in Vancouver from your perspective as delivering not only the lawyer aspect, but all the other work that you do. So please share. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. I love roundtables where everyone's talking about coordination and empowering women. So I'm really happy to be here and share my thoughts. So my perspective as a lawyer is from my law firm. It's not a big firm, and the work that I do there has been going on for about 30 years, representing women either who are fleeing persecution, so in refugee claims, or women who are out of status and advocating on their behalf to obtain legal status for them in Canada. So I'm not in a big organization, and I don't have the wonderful slides to show that have been shown by Mosaic and BC Transition Homes. I do have a PowerPoint that I put together for a presentation I did in July earlier this year. And if people want them, I have even emailed the PowerPoint to Parminder, and it'll touch upon in a bit more detail some of the things I'm going to talk about now in terms of what I'm engaged in as a lawyer for assisting women who are refugees or out of status. So first of all, in representing women who are persecuted, when I conduct those hearings and represent those women, I'm very mindful of ensuring that there's a trauma-informed hearing, and there's gender persecution guidelines that members are governed by, and in those guidelines there's accommodations that members can make to make sure that hearings are more sensitive and don't result in re-traumatizing victims. So some of the accommodations that I seek is that I may ask for a female member to hear the claimant's case. I ask for a support worker to be present at the hearing. And I also ask that it be structured a little less formally. So one of the hearings I did last year was with the claimant sitting right next to me, and right next to the claimant was her support worker, so she felt support from both sides. So I try to make sure that I get all these accommodations in place to make the process a little bit easier for my client. And in addition to just at the hearing, some work that I've recently done, there's a initiative that's being taken place to ensure that members that are hearing these refugee hearings are trauma-sensitive. So there was a list of questions sent out to stakeholders and lawyers in the community asking us for our input into what we would like to see happen. So the goal is with this initiative that there will be a group of dedicated members who will have had trauma-informed hearings and on cases involving gender persecution. And so I gave a bit of my input into that, and really emphasizing the need for members to be trained to understand the impact of trauma and how that impacts testimony given by people who are fleeing, women who are fleeing persecution or violence. And I also recommended that that training be provided to counsel as well, so counsel who are representing these people. And I'll just share briefly an example of why I feel this is important. I represented a woman last year who had previously had her case tried before the Refugee Board and was found not to be a refugee claimant. And she had a lawyer, and I'm not saying anything negative about the lawyer at all. I think there's just a lack of trauma-informed training for all participants in these very sensitive hearings. So when I took over this woman's case, and she'd suffered serious sexual assaults and very traumatized, I could see right from the get-go that she needed to have psychological counseling and assistance to help her deal with the trauma. So that was one of my first steps. And then after a period of receiving that help, I was able to obtain a report and have the matter reopened. The claimant had tried on her own to have it reopened, but it was not successful. So with the psychological evidence, I was successful in having her case reopened on the basis that there was trauma, that evidence of trauma that was not presented previously. And we after having it reopened, her case was tried afresh in front of a new member with the accommodations, with a support worker, and all the other accommodations that we were able to obtain for her. Her claim was successful in the end. And one thing I'd really like to share with you, because even as a lawyer, we often see, we feel bad for what these women have gone through, and we see them as a victim. And it's important to empower them. And it was so amazing to see at the end of this hearing where she was found to be a convention refugee. She said, "I'm no longer a victim, I am a victor." And I was so happy to hear her say those words and feel that the process that was created for her empowered her and allowed her to move forward. And she's definitely a stronger woman, and I was truly inspired by what she had gone through. So that's a bit about my, I guess, the advocacy I do in the refugee realm and helping women who are persecuted. One of my other areas of advocacy, and Harjeet knows about this because she's been involved in advocating in this as well, is representing non-status women and trying to get them, I guess, get changes made in policy and advocating for reform in policy and law. And I've been involved in that for the past 15 years. And typically, as a lawyer, when I have a client come to me who is out of status, Some of the applications that I can file on her behalf are a temporary resident permit application, which will get her temporary status in the country. That's called a TRP. And then a humanitarian and compassionate application, which will hopefully get her permanent status in the country, and that's called an H&C application. So typically, before June of last year, it would take about 6 to 9 months to get a TRP, and then up to 2 years to get PR status, permanent resident status, under the H&C application. And I apologize for throwing a lot of acronyms here. I'd mentioned earlier that I had a PowerPoint that I created for another presentation. It has a lot more details about these different types of applications. In any event, I was involved with a number of other stakeholders advocating for an expedited TRP and an expedited H&C. So last year in June of 2019, the government of Canada announced that had granted our wish. Finally, it took 10 years plus, but we have now an expedited process for getting a TRP and an expedited HC. My personal contribution to that process was coding of these applications. So these expedited applications, which are for women fleeing family violence, are coded with the initials FV, standing for family violence, and that coding is used all across Canada. And it signals to an officer when he gets these applications to pull these applications out urgently and process them on a priority basis. So I can report now with some of my clients, the H&C applications, which were taking about 2 years, are now being processed within a matter of 4 to 5 months. And the TRPs are also being processed within a number of months. And I should also say that the TRPs, when these applications are being made to get temporary status for women, they're also able to apply for an open work permit, and they will also obtain health coverage, and there are no fees for the initial application they make. Previously, before June, when you were applying for a TRP, there was no conjoining open work permit or health coverage. You got the status, which prevented removals by CBSA, but didn't give you all these other additional benefits or opportunities. So, I'm happy to report that it did take pretty much a decade plus, but we are able to now provide, and it's not obviously exclusive to BC, across Canada, an expedited process for getting temporary status and then permanent status for women who are fleeing violence. So I think that's all that I'll say in terms of answering this question.
Thank you, Kamaljeet. I think I want to just take this opportunity to acknowledge the tremendous work that you've done over the vast many years. You have been an ally with the anti-violence sector and have been the advocate for change within IRCC acts and regulations. So thank you for being there and supporting us in our work as we move forward. And I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about the work that you're doing in the next couple of questions. Thank you. I am going to move forward now with posing the same question to Maria. Maria, what are the ways in which you practice community-based advocacy work to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee immigrant women in Vancouver? And what makes this type of work and approach unique to addressing gender-based violence against non-status refugee women in Vancouver?
Yeah, I think I unmuted myself, right? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So thanks, Parminder, and I would like to acknowledge that Harjeet and I have been allies in this work, and Parminder, we were colleagues at Mosaic some years ago. And Kamaljeet, I see your name as a pro bono here at Multicultural Family Support Services for many years. So thank you for all that work. So we are a very small organization, about 22, 23 staff. We are primarily funded by the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. So our programs, Shashi Asanand, the founder and former ED who retired in 2018, so I'm fairly new in this role as an ED and also part-time. So what I have found in the organization, there is a model that was created, which is a dynamic model of looking at multicultural outreach programs, community-based victim services, child and youth programs. So those are the three main programming that we have, and they are integrated. I mean, I view it as something that's holistic because we have internal referrals as well as external referrals. So the major piece of our work is looking at supportive counseling and individual as well as systemic advocacy. I mean, systemic advocacy, I view that as more as lobbying. And that we do in partnership with BCSTH, the umbrella organizations in BC, the BC Society of Transition Houses, EVA BC, Ending Violence, Association of BC, that's the other umbrella organization that lobby and write position papers, and we sign off to say that collectively we want some changes. So those are the two areas of lobbying and advocacy that we do. And the women that we serve range from non-status, meaning women who have no status here, who have come in as students, visitors, or temporary workers and are in between contracts or in between waiting for a renewal of a visa, and then get involved in a relationship that has become abusive, and they flee from that abusive relationship, and they've somehow found their way to our organization, or they're being referred by the police if they report through the victim services, police base, as well as settlement workers and schools. They are aware of the services that we provide. So the services we provide, what makes us unique in my view is that we provide English and first language services. So all our workers here speak English and 2 or 3 first languages. So we are being relied on by enforcement officers, parole officers, lawyers, counselors, and even hospitals. They send women to us. So what we're trying to do to be able to provide the services is to evolve. It has evolved from cultural sensitivity to cultural responsiveness, meaning moving forward with action. And the latest training that we got through the, I think it was EVA BC that spearheaded it, is trauma-informed practice. So all those evolving practices are aimed to provide what is meaningful service with the women. So the women are involved in these services. You know, I view it as a spectrum. In the beginning, they consider themselves as a victim, and through the journey with us, and their journey is not just us, because as Parminder mentioned, as well as Kamaljeet, I think, and Harjeet, we work in partnership with the organizations in BC, and we try to coordinate the services towards the path of being a survivor. So that journey, we facilitate that process. I mean, in my previous work as service provider, you know, frontline, that's usually a very time-consuming and intense work, as well as safety issues on our part as service providers. So all our workers do not post their pictures or names in our website. You just see languages that we provide, and that's for our own safety for our staff, because there were instances in the past where they were targeted by community because we work with extended familial violence is violence perpetrated by members of extended family. So when the word gets out, there's something happens around threats. And recently with our project with the Civil Forfeiture Fund, we're having a partnership program with BCSTH. The threats are coming through online or through a text. So that's the new project that we're embarking on to address virtual service delivery, intervention, and providing services with the women to protect themselves. So if they are searching for a transition house, how to exit quickly and not leave a trace. And BCSTH is very good at doing that kind of programming. So I think I can end it there, given that there will be question and answers. I think I can send, I wasn't aware that we're supposed to come up with a PowerPoint. I thought this was a conversation.
You didn't need a PowerPoint, Maria. That's okay. Some speakers wanted to share a little bit more detailed information. What you've presented is amazing. And yes, of course, you're in an organization that I think pioneered providing client-centered services for multiculturally diverse women impacted by gender-based violence. And you've touched on very important points there. Thank you, Maria. So because of time, I am going to rush through a little bit. I want to transition over to the second question that we have for all of you. And I'm going to start off with asking Harjeet to focus on the challenges in doing community-based advocacy work that each of you brings to this, and the unique perspectives that you have depending on the approach that you take. So Harjeet, based on your experience, what are some of the challenges in doing this community-based advocacy work?
Thanks, Parminder. And if somebody could kindly move my slide over, that'd be great. I've got the challenges. So thank you, Margarita, for doing that. I appreciate. So I think touched on a couple of the challenges already through the projects that I spoke about earlier. So just to keep it in a nutshell, you know, the challenges that the programs that we serve face are accessibility. And again, accessibility can be multi-layered, it can be complex, it is interwoven, it is intersectional, and it includes, you know, those issues of language. You know, and again, language can be language as per English versus another language, but it also could be language as per the language of the British practitioner. So somebody might not be aware of the legal lingual when they're going to get services. So again, there is that sort of a gap of using language to access the services that you need. The other piece that there's an accessibility piece is transportation, and I touched on this earlier to a project that we have that's you know, working with Getting Home project as well. So with women who are in rural communities and are isolated, in a lot of situations we do have non-status and refugee immigrant women in different parts of BC where transportation is an issue. The closest service could be miles away. And so not having that kind of accessibility would limit them, would be a barrier. In today's world where we have COVID, not having internet access or not having strong internet access would be a barrier because you're not able to get somewhere. Offices are not open, you know, services are not being provided in those spaces. So internet access is important, and that's a challenge that's there. And we've seen that challenge grow over the years. Housing is a huge issue for non-status refugee and immigrant women. It's hard for them to leave their home to go into a transition house and then to be able to then go into the second stage or third stage or a safe home. So that becomes a barrier by itself. And I think, again, given the situation where women are further marginalized, how are they leaving, you know, parents or in-laws that they're responsible for? So in addition to the pets that they have. You know, and whose care are they leaving them in? So it becomes an accessibility issue for the women to just leave and go. She just can't do that, and that becomes a barrier. Childcare is a huge issue. Not only it's the cost, it's also where and how she access that. We all know that in a lot of GBV situations, children are used against the situations that moms are in. So again, this becomes multi-layered and more complex. So again, this touches upon the multiple issues that exist in accessibility. The next one that I had was just that sort of access and provision of culturally and linguistically appropriate services. So what that, in a nutshell, that means is that a woman can go, but she might not receive the service that she's looking for. It's not catered to that level of comfort that she's used to. Advocacy is important. So if you want to make sure something is culturally and linguistically important, for many women who are marginalized and who come from, say, having non-status, are afraid that, you know, when she go and access a service, somebody might just out her. You know, she might not be able to then get those services. She will be deported. And that's a myth that just is everywhere. So for services to be culturally and linguistically appropriate and accessible, workers need to be trained. That advocacy that's on the other side of that spectrum need to be aware of what these issues and barriers are for women who are going there and accessing these services. Another piece that's tied in with this is that whole notion of cultural safety. You know, are workers aware of what cultural safety is and what it means? And how does that come across for the woman? So it can be multifaceted again with that whole attention that needs to be on language barriers, the fears and misunderstandings about services, what's offered, what happens when you get there, the awareness that workers need to have of this multi-generational families that are living together. That's not a reality for other communities, perhaps. Right? And that sort of the multiple family members who might be the perpetrators of the violence is another area that needs to be focused on. I know that was part of the research that I did, but it also needs to be treaded lightly and cautiously, because I don't think it needs to color the oppressions that we already have, but it needs to inform the knowledge that we are gathering. So I think that piece of cultural safety needs to be key. And it needs to inform the practices and policies that we come up with. So my hope is as we move forward, we need to factor that into all the work that we do. Training, again, you know, it touches upon this whole issue of training needs to be time sensitive. It needs to be available. It needs to be appropriate. It needs to build capacity. It needs to be informed. It needs to engage. It needs to be in sync with policy. What tends to be a gap is policy tends to be developed, but the implementation phase of it lags. So somebody who is in immigration, a frontline, you know, say parole worker or immigration worker might not be aware of what changed yesterday, like what Kamaljeet spoke about, and I'm sure she can share more about this. You know, if a policy change is made, for example, the expedited TRPs, does the immigration worker know that? You know, is somebody on the front line is aware of that? Or is the woman then going to be put into a whole loop where she has to then turn around and go back and find the advocacy, and in the meantime jeopardize her own safety and her status? So again, it all needs to be in sync. It needs to be timely, and it needs to be broader than just coming up with a policy. It needs to be implemented. It needs to be evaluated. It needs to be revised, and it needs to be current, so that it's not something that was relevant yesterday and not relevant today. So I think that's critical. The other piece that says childcare, I spoke about childcare, and I think we are quite aware of those barriers of childcare. Legal, and I'm sure my colleague and friend Kamaljeet will touch on that one and how critical that is in today's landscape. Just having that knowledge, both for women and for workers, and how critical that is, and the relevancy of it. So that legal information, legal services, access to finances, access to legal aid remains critical. It is a huge gap. We have not covered that gap yet. And I think the last point that I have there is on health. I like to see that intersection between health and safety. I find that we still work in silos. It's either the healthcare system or it is the police system, or it is child protection system. We have heard this before, and I think it's still relevant that there needs to be those intersections, and they need to be acknowledged, and work needs to be done on it. We cannot have somebody who is trained in, say, for example, in a transition house work only and know the sort of the risk assessment and the risk that women faces at the intersection of health and safety, and that not being relevant and important for the healthcare worker. What we continue to see, and as per, again, the research that I've done, this is not true. In the BC context, we still have healthcare workers who are too afraid to ask, who hesitate to ask the woman whether or not she is in an unsafe situation, or whether or not she has experienced gender-based violence. So again, not asking is a huge barrier. And yet we know, according to research, asking the woman and getting her sense of the risk and danger she is in is as important as doing a risk assessment, and using a risk assessment tool. So why aren't we addressing that? And I think for non-status refugee immigrant women, they are very aware of the dangers that they face. And the gaps that they have and how hard it is for them. So again, going back to those intersectionalities and acknowledging what the gaps are. And again, factoring that into the work that we do, whether it's training, whether it's resources, whether it's funding, whether it's working with government, whether it's increasing resources. It needs to be at all levels. It needs to be intersectional. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be timely. It needs to be sensitive. And many more of those things that we have kind of known as gaps, but that have lagged behind. So I'm really encouraged of the work that Margarita, that you and Neera were talking about earlier, and your map in terms of your blueprint. And I think you so eloquently brought that together in terms of the gaps that women are facing. So that's what I have for the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Harjeet. Very thorough, very extensive, and you've done an amazing job highlighting some of the challenges. I'm sure the list can increase depending on who we're speaking to. And I think one thing that I'm walking away with is something that you touched on in terms of communication across sectors. That is so important, because that is something that we see in supporting our clients, that one may have the information that is readily available. However, when accessing the service, if a service provider doesn't have the knowledge about the policy change or the structure, then that again impacts the client and how they receive the service, or perhaps not receive the service. So thank you very much. We are moving to the next question. The next participant with the same question, and it'll be Maria. Maria, I'm going to ask you the same question based on your experience. What are some of the challenges in doing the community-based advocacy work at your organization?
Yeah, thanks, Parminder. So in terms of challenges, I highlight the systemic issues that we navigate, and that includes housing. BC housing is a big issue in the Metro Vancouver area. It's not affordable. And so we find that many of our even workers are moving towards across the bridge. I mean, for those who are not in Metro Vancouver, that means they're going into Surrey, Langley to find affordable housing. So we navigate that. It's a stopgap measure, I think, because BC Housing has given us rental assistance. But it really doesn't cover housing in Vancouver. So that gap, I think we need to have some concerted efforts to push for affordable housing for women fleeing abuse, particularly those who have no relatives here or are trying to leave an extended network to feel safe. And the other piece is around income. So welfare is low. I mean, we have been fighting for access to I think, more than minimum wage, living wages, and the income assistance to this day is really small, and we still have to fight and document, and they keep reviewing these things. So it's frustrating. The other piece is around MCFT, child protection issues. So when there are custody issues, it's a battle. You know, this is where family lawyers, through our pro bono in-house, that has helped us navigate that, but it's limited time. They only have a few hours each week. And so they push for certain things which is not really aligned with what the women are expressing. So that's a frustration. And the other thing is around law enforcement. So we have what they call the K files. These are the very high risk files where at any given point in time, the women can be killed. So we have to make a case to, it's called the integrated or interagency case assessment team in Metro Vancouver, composed of MCFD, RCMP, victim services, transition houses, and I think BC Housing is in there, where we all coordinate our efforts to ensure the woman's safety. But not every high-risk file can be considered a K file. So that's additional work that our frontline workers need to kind of navigate and figure out how to produce compelling information. And with the help of a pro bono lawyer, we're able to elevate it to a super high risk file. So those are the, I think, the major pieces that I can think of, but we're underfunded, really underfunded and precariously funded. We're being funded by our major funder year by year. I mean, how can you plan decent programming based on a year by year funding? So to me, that doesn't honor or validate the work that community-based workers do, because the funding doesn't reflect that. So I would like to write a position paper at some point with our umbrella organization to say that, look, you have now considered us as essential services, then fund us adequately at least 3 years. That way we can have some security, you know, it's still precarious, but some reassurance that our workers have their jobs. Because how do we engage in a journey that takes many years when we know year by year, I have to negotiate the funding? So, I mean, those are systemic issues. And I think I need to bring in here the concept of racialization. And with all the things in the news about Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, and discrimination in the rise, I think racialization is in the forefront of everybody's consciousness, which I would like to revisit and have full discussion on I've written a paper on it based on Sunera Thobani's concept of the exalted subjects, meaning these are descendants of the British and the French, and who speak English or French, depending on what province you live. And then the diverse others, that's the rest of us. And Statistics Canada label us as visible minority. That to me is a problematic labeling, which I think needs to be addressed because it impacts programming, including the COVID-19, which is the next question, I think. You know, how they trickle down the funding, it's problematic in my view. I mean, I can go on and on, but I will not vent here. I will co-write a position paper to express all these navigational pieces and look for something that's decent and meaningful.
Thank you, Maria. Very passionate response there, and very daring. You've actually highlighted something that's probably on all of our minds, is the funding aspect. How do we plan service delivery, and how do we look at the continuum of service delivery when we're always waiting for the next dollars to come down? I will also take this opportunity to also acknowledge that the funding that did come down during COVID-19 did allow us to continue with our service delivery out of offices. It came slow. It did come, and I'm hoping that the government will perhaps have another look at how they're doing this piece in terms of providing additional dollars for this very needed essential service, just like Maria said. So hopefully there will be some advocacy that will be happening to make that happen. And it looks like Maria is going to be doing her part. So thank you, Maria. We are going to move on, and Kamaljit, I'm actually going to ask you this question, the same one, based on your experience. What are some of the challenges in doing some of the community-based advocacy work from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to highlight about 4 challenges that I've experienced sort of on a more consistent basis. One of them I touched upon earlier, which is the need for there to be some kind of trauma-informed training for lawyers as well as the people that are hearing the cases. I gave the example of the woman I represented and the difficulties obviously she had at the first time that she presented her hearing in the member, and neither the lawyer really understanding the impact of trauma that she's experienced and how it impacted her ability to speak about her case. So I think there's a real need for training of both the people that hear cases as well as lawyers as myself that are representing vulnerable people. So that's one of the challenges that I do see that needs to be addressed. The other is, and it's been, I mentioned, I think before, it's legal aid. I've had experiences where women that are coming to me to represent them are refused legal aid because there's just a lack of funding. And then I've had to make additional submissions. And in one particular case, I was approved funding, but under a different category, under family law, so not under immigration. So there is a definite strain on the resources and the ability of women to access legal aid lawyers. And it becomes even more complex when they've got family law matters, custody issues happening simultaneously with immigration and potential removal issues and hearings in the immigration realm. And there's very few lawyers that practice both those areas. I do not practice family law, so when I have a client that is going through the family court system, I have to coordinate with that lawyer, which is a bit more challenging in terms of ensuring that both counsel have the consistent information about the client. So it adds a layer of complexity to the whole process in representing clients. So legal aid is a hurdle in terms of ensuring that women are getting coverage to get lawyers to represent them on the immigration end. And my understanding in the family law area for legal aid, it's not one big coverage that they're given. They're given coverage for bits and pieces of work at a time, which if it's disjointed, it's really difficult to represent someone in a disjointed fashion when you're constantly worried about, are you going to get covered as a lawyer for your representation? So legal aid is an area of ongoing challenge. The other is with respect to, it was more of a challenge with respect to out-of-status women facing removals proceedings. So before the expedited process was implemented in June of last year, when I represented a woman who was out of status, there was a real disconnect between the law and what the needs of the woman were. If a person is without status in Canada, the mandate of CBSA is to remove the law. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act specifically states that a CBSA must remove people who are without status as soon as possible. So you have this legislative mandate, and you have a client that's before you who you're trying to get a TRP. And again, I'm talking before June 2019, and that could take several months. So you've got this disconnect where a CBSA officer, if he discovers she's without status, can start the removals process. and an agent just filing a humanitarian application didn't prevent a removals process. It didn't act as a stay of removals. So there's a real disconnect there, but I'm happy to say that since June of 2019, when a woman makes an application under the expedited TRP, family violence, fleeing family violence, the policy does state that an immigration officer who receives that application will notify CBSA that the application is in process and to put a pause button on removals. So I'm happy to see that in policy. It would be nice to have it become actual legislation, part of the regulation, so just get a bit more strength to behind the policy wording. So that challenge has been dulled a bit, I guess. Is not as urgent as it used to be before, where we didn't have this policy saying that we're going to put a pause button on removals. But one final area that I wanted to speak about as a challenge was when I do the humanitarian applications, the way that they're processed is that if my application is deemed to have merit and the woman is found to have grounds to be granted permanent resident status, she's issued a letter which is called a first stage approval, and basically saying, yes, we agree that there's merit to your case. And then after that, then there's the process of getting security, medical, and police reports, and then issuing her a PR. So that's the final processing. But what's a bit concerning, and I'm having ongoing discussions with the Ottawa policy people on this, is that the letter that comes, the first stage approval letter that comes, has a clause in there that says we need to know if you're on social assistance, because if you are on social assistance, that can be a bar to being granted permanent resident status. So part of my advocacy right now is that, at first stage approval, a woman can apply for an open work permit. And I already mentioned earlier, under the expedited process for TRPs, she can also apply for an open work permit. And while that is, a great step forward, what it tends to ignore is that many women aren't ready to work yet. They're still dealing with the trauma. They still need counseling. They still need support before they can start working. And so to say that she cannot be on social assistance is a difficult predicament to put her in, because she needs to have an opportunity to just catch her breath and stand on some solid ground. And so when I have women in those situations where they are on where they may need to go on social assistance, I discourage them not to be on social assistance. And we've been fortunate that the transition homes have been able to support them with community donations and so forth. But there's definitely a gap here in terms of understanding the trauma women experience and the need for them to be supported. And this requirement of not being on social assistance is another barrier. My understanding from speaking to some of the on the ground people in transition homes is that, in fact, in order to get second stage housing, you may need to be on social assistance to get access to some of the next level housing. I don't know all the details there, but I'm advocating for change on this criteria that women cannot be on social assistance in order to be granted PR status. So those are the challenges that I see as a lawyer and advocate for policy reform. Thanks.
Thank you, Kamaljeet. Very good points. And I'm actually really walking away with the fact that we do have trainings for lawyers and doctors around responding to clients and victims facing gender-based violence. But I think the trauma-informed practice training will definitely help to alleviate the vicarious trauma. That is something that is a very real thing for frontline service providers and those that hear the story. So very good point there, along with everything else that you mentioned. Thank you. And I believe, Neera, you're taking over from here.
Yes, I'm taking over for here just for a second.
Okay.
So we're going to switch a little bit gears here, and we're going to talk about we're going to bring the elephant in the room, the big white elephant that we all have been dealing with since March, COVID-19. So back in April, we hosted a roundtable on COVID-19 and gender-based violence for non-status refugee and immigrant women. We know now that this crisis, it's, you know, the continuation of a crisis that was already here. It is clear that the implications of COVID-19 in Canada are humongous. It is revealing an architecture of inequality, and those who were already unprotected before the pandemic are impacted differently. So now we want to hear from our panelists to tell us how COVID-19 has impacted their work and their clients. Parminder?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And we are going to start off with asking Harjeet. Harjeet, in the context of COVID-19, why is the work of community advocacy and centering non-status refugee immigrant women's experience particular vulnerabilities especially critical at this time?
Thank you, Parminder. If Margarita, if you could change my slide for me to the last one. Great, thank you. So COVID and beyond. So for me, what resonated was the UN statement that said violence against, so gender-based violence is a shadow pandemic. And for me, that is an increased risk for both, for all, in terms of whether it is for immigrant and for non-status immigrant and refugee women. So that is a red alert. The other piece that really is of concern is the fact that research shows that isolation and loneliness are risk factors for depression and dementia. And I worry about the fact that this is the health of non-status refugee and immigrant women. So that's the critical piece that I feel that for us, we need to bring that community awareness and advocacy and center our work around. I really want to echo what Kamaljeet said earlier around the concerns and gaps that exist and the work that we need to do, and finance is a huge piece moving through this COVID period and beyond. I also want to acknowledge how long policies and practices and consistency of services take to implement. And so I want to share that Kamaljeet and I worked on the Safety of Immigrant, Refugee and Non-Status Women project through EVA BC in 2012. It took Kamaljeet 10 years to get to that place. And I think my worry and fear is that given COVID, it'll be longer before we can close gaps, for non-status refugee and immigrant women. So that is key for me. I also want to echo what Maria said in terms of a dire need for funding for frontline organizations, for advocacy, for the services that they're providing. And again, it needs to be sustained. It needs to be longer term. It needs to be inclusive, and it needs to be factoring the sort of the gaps that already exist, for many of these services. I also want to acknowledge the sort of the systemic racism and the continuum of other racism, of other isms that exist, and how important it is for us to acknowledge that as we go through this context of COVID-19, how prevalent it has become. It has almost opened a Pandora's box for us. And I think in a way we really need to confront it, and we need to be open and compassionate about it and move through it. The other pieces that I have that I think that needs to be a focus, again, housing, poverty and unemployment. And I know non-status refugee and immigrant women bear the brunt of this because they're isolated. They are unable to get to the services. They lack that accessibility that is needed for them to get out of these situations. The cultural safety, again, I cannot imagine us reaching a place of safety for non-status refugee women if we are not factoring this into the work that we do and we carry on. Systemic policy and practice, I've spoken about that, and that needs to be an intersection that we need to acknowledge. Systemic supports, and I think it is extending the capacity of organizations and transition houses and houses I know transition houses are a temporary hold for women, but it needs to be short-term and long-term housing that needs to be available for women for them to get to safety. Accessibility, again, through COVID, what's coming out, and we are seeing it more and more, is that reduced accessibility. Where it was a factor before, it definitely is an important factor now and will be critical as we move through it. Filling the gaps. I think what I want to point out as I leave this conversation is that we need to fill the gaps instead of widening them. I know these conversations are critical. I am really glad that this project is there, and I would love to see this move and into practical ground and affect and improve the lives of non-status and refugee women. But again, the gaps I feel that are widening with COVID, just given how limited the resources are. And lastly, coordination, collaboration, communication. I think we all know what we're talking about there. And so that's my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Harjeet. Very well done. Thank you. We are going to move forward. Kamaljeet, the same question, please, in the context of COVID-19. Why is the work of community advocacy and centering non-status refugee immigrant women's experiences, particular vulnerabilities, and especially critical at this time? Kamaljeet, you need to unmute.
Sorry about
Perfect.
that. Thank you. I was just saying that I agree with what Harjeet has said. I don't have a lot more to add to what she said. Everything she has said is relevant and important in this time of COVID. We have a pandemic happening within a pandemic, is the way, I think things are right now. It's very unfortunate. I guess what I've observed over the years is that pre-COVID, out-of-status women were always on high alert and risked staying in the abusive relationship because they were afraid they would be deported. I mean, it was very common for a spouse to say, if you report the abuse, I'll have you deported. And a few years back, actually, there was a real risk of that. And I'm not sure if many people know, the Canadian immigration rule had changed to it was called the conditional permanent resident category. So if someone sponsored their spouse into Canada, they were placed on sort of a probation of 2-year period, and they had to remain in a genuine relationship for 2 years before they would be granted PR status. And I know we did a lot of advocacy work before that conditional PR was put into place, saying that we're concerned about women who would end up staying in an abusive relationship if it's a conditional requirement. And so there was an exception created saying that if you were abused, you could make submissions to be exempted from having to stay in it for 2 years. But it was just a tedious process. And eventually it was basically that law was removed around 2017. But that threat that out-of-status women face, or that concern of being deported, is real. I've touched upon they need to get a TRP status, and yes, we have an expedited process, but if they're unaware of that process or unsuccessful in getting it, and they remain out of status, they are removable. And we've had reports before, Harjeet referenced a project that we did, and during that time we had reports of women calling the police for help to get out of abuse, and because they were out of status, they were reported to CBSA, who then started the removals process, and they were deported or stuck in a removals process. So now we've got some opportunities to help them on an expedited basis to remain in Canada. But with COVID now, and even though the current expedited TRP allows for an open work permit, with businesses shutting down, less and less opportunity or difficult times finding employment, people are staying stuck at home in these abusive circumstances. And when we already had these women being reluctant to leave because they were afraid of being removed, you add the layer of COVID on it, and it becomes that much worse. And I think we just got to be vigilant and make sure that these women are aware of the legal avenues that are available to them. And yeah, and funding is going to be a big issue here to make sure we have the resources to help them get out of these abusive relationships even during this pandemic. But beyond that, I don't think I have anything further to add. I think Harjeet's done a very good job in highlighting the challenges we faced during COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamaljeet, for sharing. And Maria is up next. And before we have her say her piece, I just want to acknowledge that we are running over time, and we do want to honor your time and as well provide a chance for us to wrap up in a very meaningful way. There's a lot of good conversation that's taking place here. Maria, the same question for you in the context of COVID-19. Why is the work of community advocacy and centering non-status refugee immigrant women's experiences, particular vulnerabilities, especially critical at this time?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this question because we're working on the ground. And so, as you know, some people call it we're on the trenches. So I think some practical things have come up, and we need to raise this to the level of awareness across the sector, and particularly that BC is going on an election. We can provide some very compelling platforms to get them to talk about these issues. So issues around access to technology, you know, how to break down the isolation that Harjeet has spoken and Kamaljeet has spoken, that I also alluded to, because they have no access to these things. They are on poverty or below poverty level. And so we're relying on some generosity of certain groups or what do you call them? The businesses with a social conscience to donate cell phones, lab refurbished equipment, so we can enable some of the women to participate in virtual platforms. And the same thing for our staff. When we coming into this pre-COVID, we only had 2 laptops in the office. So we were struggling to find money to buy laptops to enable staff to work remotely. So those are very practical things that has happened because of COVID. But pre-COVID, we knew it was there. It just resurfaced and kind of hit you in the forefront of your consciousness that, hey, you know, we need all these things if you want me to continue to work. And then the ongoing conversation about fatigue. You know, these Zoom fatigue, working at home surrounded by family and you have no space to do your work with your laptop. Someone was sharing she was in her closet just to make sure there's some privacy. So we have to figure out on an ongoing basis how to address this. And I thank BCSTH for the partnership that we have. We're having some strategies and to partner up with BCSTH on how to navigate technology through a grant that we received, as well as Douglas College. So we have partnered with a community college to provide how-tos, because staff need to do the training, then they in turn will train the clients, you know, at some point, maybe in January. So those are just some of the things that I think we're trying to do. And the other piece that I would like to highlight is we have now introduced evidence-based practice. So we hired someone through that funding that came through to document on Excel files the increase of numbers that had come through the email or through the phone and now through the internet. So we have to document that to show that, listen, you know, things are happening, and if you want evidence, we've got it. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Margarita. Margarita,
Yes.
thank you.
All right. So thank you so much. Wow, that was so much information. It was really interesting. And I just want to thank all of the speakers for taking time to join us and share their insights and their practices. We've learned so much. I don't want this conversation to end. A big thank you to our co-hosting partner today, Mosaic Perminder, for all of your work in coordinating and organizing such a dynamic session. Fantastic job. And a big thank you to our OCASI team and all the members of our National Steering Committee of this project have really provided a lot of support and ongoing feedback. We hope that today's session is leaving you feeling maybe inspired, maybe it deepens your interest to stay connected to our project and activities as well. And I do just want to take a few moments to, I really want to respect people's time as well, because I know we're going over right now, but some really fantastic points that were talked about today. In particular, just, hearing about and understanding and talking about understanding GBV and violence against non-status refugee immigrant women it's really grounded in an understanding of intersectionality and approaching advocacy from this approach. It's really, the strength of a conversation like this where people are speaking from different standpoints. I liked how Maria mentioned, some from the trenches, from different sectors. And it's also really encouraging today to hear how people have been working together. So the history that some of you have in terms of the work that you've been doing, how that, gets crossed and overlapped. And it's also really helpful today. I thought, what really stuck with me also is it's helpful to hear how Maria spoke about the systemic advocacy. I think in our project, we've been talking a lot about the importance of naming and talking about it in that way. So it's helpful to think about it, about the advocacy that's happening at this kind of systemic level and what can we do to further organize and work on that. And I think also really inspiring to hear, as Kamaljit expressed, how much this work has been taking over time, right? In this case, over years, that Harjeet and Kamaljit really expressed as well. The ideas of it being precariously funded. How can we be planning for decent kinds of intervention and programming? And it's such a significant, a really critical point to raise. For the sustainability of these projects, the importance of the trauma-informed piece in the frameworks that should not be exclusive to just those who are working with victims of violence, but thinking of it more in a broader sense as well. And I think also in what I want to also bring up as well is that what is important is that if we are truly wanting to address the issues of gender-based violence against NSRI women, we know that it involves addressing like the really deeply entrenched structural institutional racism that shapes, our immigration system, and it shapes all those systems that scaffold essentially the available supports and services for NSRI women in Canada. So I feel very, there's a lot of passionate conversation that was happening in here, and we're really grateful for your time, for sharing with us today. I don't want to leave without saying that there are ways in which you can continue to stay involved with us in our project and stay up to date with future plans. One plan that's happening at the end of November is that we are hosting a conference style. So bringing together, the idea would be we've had roundtables across different regions. What happens when we have a conversation bringing people together from those different regions as well? So please join our project mailing list. That's where we will be sharing updates, upcoming events, and invitations for the regional network organizing as well. Our initiative to end gender-based violence in immigrant and refugee communities, the website, that's where you'd be able to find, for example, the recordings for these types of roundtables and summaries as well. And follow us on Twitter on OCASI, at OCASI GBV, because we are sharing, the updates and information from our partners and also events that are taking place. So with that being said, we hope that you do join our network that is growing. We want it to be a strong national network among service providers, organizational leaders, community members, advocates, and non-status refugee and immigrant women, so we can really strengthen our ongoing work addressing GBV against immigrant women. And also to really highlight that point that Maria said, we are also, collecting this information as data so that we can also highlight new areas of priority, areas that should be also funded and not neglected. So I think that really calls attention. These are urgent and unique issues of GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada, but they're not new issues. Thanks again to everybody who's here and also for staying over a few minutes with us. We really appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Enjoy, in this case, enjoy your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Great job, Parminder. We lost her. All right, I'm just going to close down the recording and the screen.